Chancy and the Grand Rascal by Sid Fleischman. 3. The Coming and Going Man. The eggs were hatching like popcorn in the suitcase. By morning, Chancy counted 18 chicks and more to come, but he wanted to be on his way and decided to take the remaining eggs with him. One huge brown one had caught his eye, and he was curious to see the chick that hatched out of it. He might be able to peddle the newborn chicks along the way. "I'll split you some cookwood for my meals and lodging," he said. "I'm tolerably handy with an axe." "Got plenty, thanks, just the same," Mr. Pickawilly smiled, pulling on his sleeve guards. "But that gives me an idea. When you get to the river, just stack some firewood on the bank. Lay up 8 cords if your back holds out. One of them steamboats will stop and buy it off you. Bound to. They burn up a smart lot of wood, you know. Hardly carry a half-day supply, most of them. There's wood yards all along the river, and no reason you can't make yourself steamboat fare, and then some. How does that strike you?" Chancy's eyebrows lifted at the possibility. "By dogs! Chip the wood, 4 foot long, and you charge $1.50 a cord, hear?" "Yes, sir." Chancy was dazzled. He now saw a fortune waiting for him. Why, he'd chop a hill of wood, an almighty mountain of wood, and he could sell his poultry along the way. He'd arrive in Paducah weighted down with cash money. Mr. Pickawilly paid him for the chicks and weighed up a sack of mash. The chicks that hatched on the road would have to be fed. Chancy found a place in the wheelbarrow for the mash and filled his cider jug with fresh water. Then he ran back his lanky hair and pulled on his hat. "Thank you, sir. Thank you for everything. Good luck. And here, I cut you a piece of bacon rind to grease that wheel. It squeaks something terrible." A moment later, Chancy was strutting down the road. He turned and gave Mr. Pickawilly a final wave. He was feeling downright lighthearted again. 6 more chicks hatched during the heat of the day. Chancy punched holes in the straw suitcase for air and stopped now and then to turn the eggs. None of the brown ones had yet hatched without the hen to keep turning them and to keep them warm. Well, the days were hot enough and the nights too, and he supposed the eggs had been upended often enough as they traveled about in the suitcase. The 6 chicks kept chirping and peeping, and it was like having a small orchestra along. He fixed a gourd of water in the suitcase and continued on his way. He offered the chicks for sale to passer-by, but when night fell, he still had 6 left. It would be easier to sell fleas to a dog, he thought. The farmers had poultry of their own. They'd be glad to sell him. He slept that night in a cornfield and reached the river late the following morning. He could smell it first, something fresh and heavy in the air. Then he got a shimmering glimpse through the woods. Finally, he trundled the wheelbarrow through a tangle of high-water debris, across a dry and cracked mud flat, and didn't stop until he was ankle-deep in the Ohio River. He gave a whoop and a holler and wished Jody could be here to see it himself. It was the grandest sight he could recall. The river stretched 1/4 of a mile wide and so sparkling in the sun that it might have been covered with fish scales. That would be Kentucky on the other bank, and it seemed uncanny to stand in the state of Ohio and look at the state of Kentucky. The river was low, easy-moving, and hardly bothering to make any sound at all. For a moment nothing stirred but a dragonfly chasing about in the sun. Chancy gazed at the Ohio and felt like some great trailblazer who had just discovered it. He followed a bend in the river to the shade of an overhanging swamp willow and shoved the wheelbarrow out of sight in a tall bristle of cattails. Then he shucked his clothes and took a leap. The cold water hit him like the kick of a mule, but it felt splendid. He pushed aside a stumpy log and found himself in the water with a 90-pound catfish. The catfish, brown as mud, left in a hurry. Chancy broke off a willow twig, chewed the end until it was frayed, and brushed his teeth. He was filled with a wondrous sense of achievement. He had reached the Ohio. He was swimming in it. Paducah was somewhere downriver, and he'd get there too. He'd find Indiana, and maybe she'd know where to start looking for Mirandy and little Jamie. But Paducah would have to wait while he stacked up cordwood. He looked with calculating eyes at the fallen trees and uprooted stumps tossed high and dry by old floodwaters. It was his for the gathering and the chopping. In his mind, the woodyard grew to magnificent proportions. He was eager to get started. He was pulling his shirt over his head when he thought he heard a sound in the distance. A moment later, he saw a man sauntering around the bend. Chancy gave a start. The approaching stranger was wearing a slouch hat. Chancy dropped down among the cattails and held his breath. The river abounded with scoundrels this time of year, didn't it? Even Mr. Pickawilly warned him about that. Slowly parting the cattails, Chancy watched as the man came tramping along the dry bank above. His boots were scuffed and dusty. He was huge and broad-shouldered, with a rolled army blanket slung across his back. A thin black cigar, crooked as a twig, was locked between his teeth. A bounder for sure, Chancy thought. He carried a tattered carpet bag in each hand. His coat flapped with every step, and his yellow calico vest shone in the sun. Chancy became aware of the faint chirps and squeaks from the suitcase beside him. His breath caught. The chicks would give away his hiding place. And then the man stopped. His sharp eyes seemed to range over the cattails. Chancy didn't move. The chicks were peeping away merrily. Chancy began to edge closer to the handle of his pa's 4-pound axe. That stranger had better keep his distance. Then the summer stillness was broken by the blast of a steam whistle. A riverboat loaded with mules came huffing and clanking around the bend. The stern wheel kicked up a waterfall, and the sound of the chicks was drowned out. The stranger gave a shrug and continued on his way. Chancy waited. The wash of the steamboat reached the cattails and started them swaying and rustling. Chancy peered at the stern wheeler. How it strutted, and how he wished he were aboard, making for Paducah. When the stranger was well out of sight downriver, Chancy picked up the wheelbarrow and headed upriver. That man was looking for mischief, he thought. He might have tried to make off with the 4-pound axe. Chancy was well rid of him. When he had gone almost a mile, he stopped to gaze at an island standing out of the river like a turtle shell. He meant to pick a spot for his woodyard carefully. It was a fat little island with shady willows growing as rank as weeds. That might do fine. He could see a litter of snagwood and fallen trees to start on. By dogs, that was the place for his woodyard. He rolled up his trouser legs and shoved the wheelbarrow into the shallow channel. He was careful not to capsize the chicks, the eggs, and his belongings. A moment later, he took possession of the island. There was no one to greet him but 5 crows flocked on the root of an overturned tree stump. They clapped their black wings and flew off, calling to Kentucky across the river. Chancy had never been on an island before. He dug his feet in the warm earth and surveyed his small domain. He wondered if it had a name. Probably not, he thought. It was just a trifling island. He imagined. Maybe no man had ever set foot there before. He liked the thought. He folded his arms and decided to name the place Crow Island. Within 20 minutes, he had every foot of the island explored. He found a broken oar, a tar bucket with some tar still in it, the arm of a chair, and half a red barn door. Best of all, he found a patch of watermelon vines growing wild at the lower end of the island. He picked out the ripest melon and split it open with his axe. He let the chicks on the ground, cut them a chunk to peck at, and settled himself in the shade to eat. After a while, he got up and turned the brown eggs. He wondered if they were ever going to hatch, especially that huge one. But after they hatched, what in tarnation would he do with them? No fancy steamboat was going to pull up to Crow Island and ask to buy his poultry, and he couldn't turn them loose. Chicken hawks would get them for sure. He watched them clustered at the melon rind, squeaking away like a flock of hinges. Now that they were 2 days old, they were beginning to eat. It was a peck of trouble having chicks along, but they were good company. He didn't feel entirely alone with something live and friendly chasing around his feet. With the days and nights so hot, they didn't need a brooder to keep warm. He couldn't have them underfoot when he began felling trees. He'd better coop them. He laid out 4 dead limbs in the shape of a box and plugged the chinks with dirt. That would do fine. He lifted the chicks one by one and set them inside. They rolled off his hand like yellow balls of sunlight. He fixed the water gourd in a corner and scattered a handful of mash. Then he unloaded the wheelbarrow and chose the spot for his woodyard. He'd build it on the river side of the island so that the steamboats could see it. He started out with the wheelbarrow and returned with a load of driftwood. By late afternoon, he had gathered most of the dead limbs and snagwood to be found on the island. He chopped the longer pieces into 4-foot lengths and began stacking. By nightfall, he had better than half a cord laid up. When he finished, he stood back in a glow of sweat and looked it over with satisfaction. His woodyard was underway. Nearby, he propped the slab of barn door against two stumps that made a fine shelter. Sometime during mid-morning, the brown eggs began to hatch. Chancy had busied himself with a spindly, lightning-struck willow. The trunk was hardly as thick as stovepipe. He'd felled it, stripped the branches, and chopped it into lengths. He was hauling them to the woodpile when he noticed 3 red chicks flitting around the coop. They had already dried off and found their legs. "Well, howdy," he grinned. He sat on his haunches and watched the goings-on. The new chicks gave him darting glances with their black, buckshot eyes. He could hear the tap-tap-tap of other chicks pecking away inside their shells. Soon the top of an egg broke away, and Chancy could see the wet, scrawny chick inside. It fell back, exhausted, but soon it began struggling out of the shell. It kicked and scratched, half in and half out. Finally it was free. Then it went stumbling about, unable to master its pinkish legs. It rested and tried again. Chancy stood up. Before long it would be rushing around with the others, and watching wouldn't get his wood stacked. And the big brown egg hadn't yet hatched. That was the one he was waiting for. He got back to work. When he finished with the spindly willow, there were 11 newborn chicks in the coop. He stopped long enough to eat and put an edge on the axe with his small whetstone. He was getting quite a flock. They didn't chirp and chitter, and didn't they chirp and chitter? He suddenly remembered a long time ago when his father had brought home a Shanghai rooster. It had pecked at everyone's legs and chased his sister Indiana half a mile down the road. They had had to get rid of it. Chancy picked out a branchy tree not far off at the edge of the island. He calculated he could get half a cord out of the tree, limbs and all. The axe rang out. He stopped now and then to spit on his hands. It might take him the rest of the month to lay up 6 or 8 cords, but every bite the axe edged him closer to Paducah. Finally, when he had the tree almost balanced to fall, he looked up and saw a man standing 15 feet away. He was thunderstruck. It was the wide-shouldered man in the dark slouch hat. Chancy tried not to betray his surprise. It wouldn't do to let this man see that he was scared. "Nice day," he said. "Fine day." The man was peering at him with squinted green eyes. A smile spread around the cigar clamped between his teeth. He put down his 2 carpet bags and unshouldered his bedroll. Chancy didn't trust the man's smile. "I wouldn't stand that close, sir," he said. "This big old tree is fixing to fall." "Big?" The man laughed. "Why, Chancy, I generally pull small trees like that up by the roots." Chancy. How had this river vagabond learned his name? From Colonel Plug, most likely. That scoundrel must have told him about the fine 4-pointed axe, about the fine 4-pound axe Chancy had along. Chancy's muscles tightened, and he watched for any sudden movement. The wing feather of a hawk was tucked in the man's hatband. His boots were dripping wet. He had come wading across to the island. "I declare," he said, studying Chancy closely. "You don't look like you've been getting enough to eat, boy. It wouldn't hurt to fatten you up. You could take a bath in a shotgun barrel." I got along plenty to eat," Chancy answered defiantly, and was immediately sorry he had admitted it. "Splendid!" The stranger laughed, and the hawk's feather quivered in his hat. "I'm hungry. You've been as hard to catch as a squirrel, I don't mind telling you that." "I'm not caught yet, sir." Chancy didn't move from the tree trunk. A mere push and the willow would go crashing down. That man would find himself driven into the ground like a stake. "Don't come any closer," the man chuckled. "You're mighty skittish about strangers, I can see that. But you wouldn't turn away a hungry man, would you? And we're not purely strangers, not if your name's Chauncey B. Dundee." "No, sir, it ain't. You just missed him. He's heading upriver to Cincinnati. I believe if you hurry, you might actually catch up." "We are not strangers," the man went on. "Not if you left Squire Starbuck's place 5 days ago. Not if you've got a sister Indiana and a brother Jamie and a sister Mirandy. And not if the B in your name stands for Buckthorn after your ma's side of the family." Chancy felt his eyes go as hard as oak knots. He was stunned. This was far more than he had told Colonel Plug. "Tarnation, who are you, sir?" "Me?" The man laughed, and the hawk's feather quivered again. "Why, Chancy, I'm a coming and going man. That's who I am. I can shoe a runaway horse and outcalculate a pack of foxes. I'm half fox myself, and the other half prairie buffalo. I'm a wayfaring printer, mule skinner, soldier, tinkerer, barn painter, and everything in between. I've been clear to California, and I once pulled a wagon with my teeth. If that don't suit you, why, I can outlaugh, out-exaggerate, and out-rascal any man this side of the Big Muddy, and twice as many on the other. Look at these eyes of mine, cat's eyes, same as yours. Didn't they tell you there was a grand rascal in the family, Chancy? Didn't they tell you about your wandering, fiddle-footed uncle, your darling mother's own brother? By the eternal, boy, drop that axe and come say howdy to your uncle, Will Buckthorn. And that's the end of chapter 3.